Hello, Fight Club members. In a change to our traditional format of webinars, today I'm going to be interviewing Clint Davey, all the way from Australia. Clint is an emerging game designer with a background in war game design, and he himself is a history teacher. And hopefully we're going to get into 3 of his games today in the next hour or so. Clint, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. We've already chatted about the time difference. I appreciate you're looking a lot better than me in this particular shot thus far. As alluded to, you're a game designer, you're a history teacher. Talk me through your background.
Yeah, sure. So I've always loved history, and I got into wargaming fairly early on. But tabletop gaming first, but then the thing that got me into board gaming was Axis and Allies, and that was probably when I was, 13 years old. And I've just loved it ever since, and played a lot of games over the years. Went into history teaching because that was where I could, I guess, use my passion to get a career. And now I sort of spend my days teaching history to high school kids, and then I spend my evenings and my weekends working on games wherever I can. I've got small children as well, which take up a huge amount of my time, but my spare time goes mostly on games. So I haven't actually made any money out of it yet, but that, as anyone in the industry will tell you,
live in hope, brother.
It's not where you go to make money.
What's game night like in the Davey household?
Well, I usually have some friends over in the school holidays. I've got a lot of friends who are teachers, and we'll do all day sessions of Axis and Allies, the big global version with the 2 maps, which is great.
Would I be right to assume that you don't play Monopoly or any of those?
No, that's ones? They're not real games. I actually do play a lot of Euro games as well, though. So I don't know if your audience is familiar with that concept, but Euro games are sort of non-war related games, mostly sort of German designed, that are almost mathematical, kind of puzzly. Not a lot of randomness, not a lot of dice rolling, not much conflict. So things like, they started with Settlers of Catan, but it's things like Agricola, like farming games, games that you play as a merchant, or something more peaceful. So they're not war games, but they do give you a lot of ideas you can use in wargaming. So you'll see with a lot of my games, the focus is not actually on the combat. It's kind of on the stuff that happens behind the combat. And that's true for all 3 of the ones we're going to look at today. And I'll get a lot of ideas for that from Euro games. So that's a bit of my background, regarding both what I do as my day job and also how I got into gaming.
And it's a great way to harvest mechanics by playing games. Possibly something we'll get into when we talk about your classroom stuff. But introducing children straight to wargaming can be seen as a bit aggressive, and possibly isn't in flavor with maybe the more liberal view of the world that we have today. And certainly one of the problems with using war games is that the first criticism is that why are we studying war, in the same way that studying war at often universities has to be retitled to conflict studies or sort of history of warfare. I don't know if you found similar sort of frictions there. Yeah,
definitely. But I mean, I guess if you were actually interested in avoiding wars happening, which I am, I really don't want wars to happen. But you need to understand how they work, and you need to understand how they work first of all, so you don't just blunder into a stupid one. You need to understand the costs, but also when you're actually fighting one, you need to be able to do it in a way that's going to minimize your casualties and bring that war to a speedy conclusion. So you do actually need to know about logistics and command and control and a whole bunch of other things, whether regardless of your opinion on whether war is good or not. Obviously, we all think it's bad, but if you want to bring wars to a speedy conclusion, then you need to understand how they're actually fought. And I mean, I say bring up Ukraine as an example. All of us want the Ukraine war to be over, but it's not like the Russians are going to just stop. It's not like the Ukrainians are just going to stop. It's going to have to end in a victory of one side or the other. All right. So if you're in a position where you're making decisions on that, you need to understand how wars are actually fought. So I think there's perfectly valid role for war gaming, not just for the military, but anyone in a position of government power where they're making decisions, in foreign policy, where they're making decisions on which kind of allies we're going to be funding, where our money's going, and so on. You need to understand how wars are actually fought, and wargaming is, I think, the best way to do that. And I think you guys would be inclined to agree that that is a good way to learn it. So I do use war games in the classroom for mainly for teaching history. But yeah, I don't do it in a way that is jingoistic or nationalist. I don't go about like encouraging people to be warlike and to find it amusing or whatever. I do treat it fairly seriously. But yeah, I think basically you need to understand how wars are fought on the ground. You need to understand the logistics, the command, just the nuts and bolts of how it actually works. So that's my view on it.
And it's not my quote, but I certainly remember reading somewhere that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And it's another sad fact of life that a lot of people in Ukraine who had no interest in warfare or anything are getting absolutely saturated by the effects of it. So it is important that we don't dismiss it as something from a bygone era. Back to the questions. What was the first war game you designed?
Going back many years, I designed a game based on the conflicts between the great powers of Europe from about the 15th century to the 19th century. So it was like a grand strategy game where you could play as Britain, France, Spain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, all those countries. And it came in a series of scenarios. I never got it published. I never even pitched it to a publisher. It was just one I made for fun to play with me and my friends. And that one, I can't even remember the name of it now. It was quite a long time ago, but that was a pretty fun game to make. But the first game that I've made that's actually been accepted by a publisher is Werewolf, which is the one we're going to talk about very soon. One
of three. One of three.
Yes.
Okay, bringing me on to that then. So you have a particular attraction. I would say you have a particular attraction to World War II in terms of playing and designing war games. Why is that?
I would put it down to two things. Playing Axis and Allies back when I was a teenager, I just was immediately intrigued, especially like the strategic position of the United States versus the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, and the UK. How those five countries had a totally different strategic situation. I thought that was just endlessly fascinating, and how the US was so distant from the conflict, and they had to get their men across two enormous oceans to get them into battle, whereas the Soviet Union had an enemy right on their doorstep. And also the combination of land, sea, and air. I just found all that really interesting. And then the other thing, I guess, that really sparked my interest was seeing Saving Private Ryan when I was probably 12. That came out in the late 90s. And I saw that, and I don't know, I guess it like horrified me, I guess. I saw it as a kid. I was like, I can't believe this actually happened. And then that got me started researching, see, is this realistic? Is this what actually happened? I go, yeah, this is what actually happened. And then I thought, how can you make that into a game? And I actually originally thought, when I first saw that movie and I saw the Omaha Beach scene, I thought my thoughts did get out to gaming, and I thought there's no way you could game that, because it just looked too chaotic. It just looked, there's too much going on. There's no way you could, like, the time scale, and there's so much going on. How could you even understand it? I don't think even reading a book would let you understand it, because when it shows you what the soldiers are experiencing, it's like, this is just chaos. You can't make any sense of it. And then that got me onto the journey of like, how do you make a game that allows you to understand the history? So yeah, those two things, I'd say Axis and Allies and Saving Private Ryan, just got me obsessed with World War II, and that's been an obsession that's lasted for about 20 years now.
And in your day job as an educator, you've started to bring in what you're sort of calling classroom games to engage your students and to attack the material from a different direction. I don't want to go too deep into this. This could be probably a completely separate webinar, but why do you think there was a market or a gap in the traditional methods and medium of teaching that games could solve?
Well, there's a lot that can be fixed with methods of teaching. I use games because, first of all, it gets every student engaged immediately, and gets them all making decisions, and especially when they're competing with each other to win. But even if they're not competing, even if it's a cooperative game, I've run co-op games before as well, where all the class is trying to beat the game together. What it does is it brings a lot of students out of their shell and gets them talking to each other. It gets them making decisions and being in control of something, rather than just being talked at, or even just looking at a PowerPoint or reading a textbook. They have to make decisions, and they have to actually be engaged with the material. And it gets them talking to each other, gets them doing hands-on tactile stuff like moving pieces around. It really gets them thinking and engaged in a way that it's so much more engaging than a traditional lesson. You'd have to just see it to believe it. I've had, classes full of kids that are quiet and shy, they're bored, not interested, and you've got 30 of them all around a table because we're simulating the Battle of Tobruk with 15 mil scale models, and they're moving around panzers and Australian soldiers in this desert terrain, and they're talking to each other about where we're going to attack and how's this going to work, and you get a whole classroom engaged, and that's amazing to see. And I wish more educators would use it. And I try to get. That's why I make my classroom games available basically for free. I just post them on Twitter. I go, if anyone out there wants a classroom game, I'll just send it to you. I've got heaps of them. But I would really like to get more teachers using that kind of stuff because it gets kids engaged. Any
pushback from teachers or parents on that method?
No pushback at all. They love it. They're amazed by it. And no one has said, oh, but the kids aren't learning, because they obviously are learning. They obviously are learning, and that's why. And you can ask them afterwards. What did you learn from this? They can tell you.
I was thinking more of the soccer mom who asks her child, "What did you learn at school?" And then and the answer is something like, "I killed somebody with a panzer."
Yeah, surprising you get none of that, because I think if kids come home from school and they're excited about what they're learning, I think most parents are kind of okay with that, and especially because it's history. We have to teach. I don't know, it's probably the same in the UK, but in Australia we do have to teach World War I and World War II. And we have to spend usually at least 6 months on each of those conflicts, depending on which school you work at. But they students have to learn about it, so they're going to learn about it anyway. It's not a subject that you can just sort of make it. You can't sugarcoat it or you can't whitewash it. They're going to learn about conflict and war and violence. They have to learn about it, and then at least if they can learn about it in a way where they actually understand it and are immersed in it, I think that's better than them being bored and just having it force fed to them. So
I suppose also given the sort of proliferation of media these days, they can watch the Ukraine war literally on their phone in their lunch hour.
Oh yeah.
And before that they could be watching maybe less structured violence, fighting and the sort of darker edges of the internet, and teenagers and young people are often very good at getting around their parents' sort of perceived sort of limits. So actually having a structured education about warfare, it being about politics and not just about the sort of innate animal instinct to fight, that would probably be all for the benefits.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, we'll get into the actual the questions that you had for me.
We could talk about this all day.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to put up our first of 3 games. So we're going to talk about a game called Werewolf, a game called Division Commander, and then hopefully we still have time, Eastern Theatre of Operations. So the first one is Werewolf, which I'm now showing on the screen. I'll just do a bit of a summary to kick it off, and then go into you. So it's a 2 to 4 player card-driven game using the coin series mechanics. The 4 factions that are in play are the Western Allies and their pro-Western Germans, the Soviets and their proto-communist German allies, the werewolf Nazi guerrilla terrorists, and the Edelweiss, who are the remnants of the anti-fascist army and old order aristocrats. And the setting is the end of World War II, not necessarily defined as neatly as the end, but the ending of World War II into the sort of start of the Cold War. 1945 to 1948 is what you've put on the sort of box. And it's being published by Legion Wargames. I believe you've already got orders in at the moment.
Yes, yeah, we do. We're up to 184 pre-orders, and as soon as we hit 250, it'll be bumped up to the top of Legion's production schedule. But it will get made this year. I'm confident that we'll get to that number. And we're going to have some prototype copies on the way soon to send to reviewers. So we're still getting the word out, but it's going to get made. And we've had a lot of interest about it from various quarters. Just a lot of people who like the coin series are going to love this, because that's where it's inspired from. But also anyone that's interested in World War II and the Cold War, and in particular this particular topic, no one's ever made a game on it, is the werewolves. So the werewolves were a real thing. This is an alternate history game, so we've actually changed the historical timeline a bit. and we've exaggerated some things, but the werewolves were a real thing. So it's towards the end of the war, Hitler and Goebbels and a lot of top guys in the SS were arming large numbers of guerrillas to fight an insurgency against the Allies and the Soviets as they invaded Germany. So this was a combination of a couple of different things. It was kind of SS special forces working with Hitler Youth recruits and just ordinary German civilians to sort of start sabotage, ambush, and other insurgent operations behind enemy lines as the enemy closed in on German soil. So historically, the werewolves probably killed about 1,000 people after the Allies and Soviets started setting foot on German soil. So 1,000 people is not nothing. They did do a bit of damage, but historically they were crushed. The Allies and the Soviets wiped them out, but they did make the occupation of Germany a lot more draconian than what it would otherwise have been. So they did have an effect historically, and the symbol, the werewolf symbol, which is the wolf's angel, which you can see in the game there, is still technically illegal to display in Germany, because there was a fear for a long time after the war ended that there were still werewolves hiding underground, that could rise up at any moment. And likewise, when the American army was going into Germany, they were told there are still 2 million Nazi Party members who are underground and could rise up in a revolt at any time and restart this war. So they were told, don't fraternize with German civilians, don't trust them, don't go near them, don't go down a dark alleyway at night. If you're driving in a Jeep on the highway, keep an eye out for roadside bombs. So if you think about what the US Army was dealing with in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's what they were anticipating was going to happen in Germany. It didn't, for many reasons, partially because Hitler didn't fund the werewolves very much. They weren't well organized, they weren't well trained, they weren't that many of them. And the Allies and the Soviets crushed them very swiftly. But Allied planners, when they were planning the occupation of Germany, were expecting this to be a very long insurgency. So if you can imagine, Germany in 1945 was expected to be something like Vietnam in the late 60s or Afghanistan in the 2000s. That's what they were planning for and expecting. And so this game basically takes the idea that, well, what if that actually happened? What if the worst fears of the Allies actually came true and Germany flared up in an insurgency after the war and they have to spend years hunting it down and squashing this rebellion? And then it is rooted in history. The only one of those 4 factions that we have kind of diverted from history significantly is Edelweiss, which is the yellow guys. That's the other guerrilla faction. So this is the anti-Nazi resistance movement. They were also anti-communist. So the Edelweiss movement was a real thing. They actually called themselves the Edelweiss Pirates. They were a youth movement that was around before World War II. They were anti-Nazi and anti-communist, and they existed after the war as well. And Allied intelligence had to kind of root them out and shut down their operations too. But we've actually merged the historical Edelweiss movement with the other anti-Nazi groups. So like Klaus von Stauffenberg, the Valkyrie plot, which that group was called the Black Orchestra. So we've got the Black Orchestra is the leadership class of this Edelweiss insurgency. So they're Prussian aristocrats, former members of the Abwehr, and people like Stauffenberg who had high up positions in the Reich, but hated Hitler and the Nazis and thought they were destroying Germany, and they wanted to become the next legitimate government of Germany. So yeah, you've got those 4 factions all competing. Basically, it's the Allies are trying to build democracy, the Soviets trying to build communism, the werewolves are trying to bring back the Third Reich, and Edelweiss are trying to bring back this kind of aristocratic, Prussian, pre-Nazi German kingdom. So yeah, that's the game in a nutshell. That's the theme of the game anyway. And it's an alternate history timeline where a lot of stuff has gone differently. Some people are still alive when they weren't. Some people are dead. Certain technologies haven't been invented yet, and so on. But yeah, that's the theme of the game in a nutshell.
Were any readings or literature part of the inspiration to write this? Because as you said, it's sort of a hypothetical, counterfactual. So, and there are elements which clearly did happen. You've got the atomic weapon scientist aspect. You've got the Marshall Plan. But where did you sort of sit up one day after reading something and say, "I'm going to make this game"?
Yeah, I did. I heard a line on a interview or a podcast somewhere where the discussion was about World War II and about the occupation of Germany, and someone said, he said, "Look, it's not like the Allies had to worry about werewolf IEDs blowing up under American Jeeps. That was not a real concern. Okay. And I'd never heard the word werewolf used in that context. I immediately started searching up the werewolves. And I came across some books that helped me on that journey. So like Harry Turtledove has got some books, alternate history books, basically about this very topic. But also there's an academic scholar from Canada called Perry Bitterscombe, who has written many books on he's probably the world's foremost expert on the werewolves. So his stuff is really good too. He documents every known kill that the werewolves had. So that's how we get this figure of they probably killed 1,000 people. Is Bitterscombe has documented all of them, and they range from Soviet generals to ordinary German factory workers who sided with the Americans, ex-members of the Wehrmacht who were seen surrendering and then assassinated later on because they were seen as surrendering. Also, the werewolves, they attempted to poison people. They had snipers. They had various ways of taking people out. But yeah, so his academic work was really helpful. But the vast majority of the game is just historical events that are fairly widely known. I mean, some of them are very obscure, but most of the game is just historical stuff that we have changed. So we didn't just, we see the cards here. I would say the 99% of the cards are based on a real historical event that we have just tweaked slightly to fit in our timeline. So yeah, like these ones you've got up on the screen here. We've got the Nuremberg trials. We've got the Cambridge Five, Marshal Zhukov, the Morgenthau Plan. These are all real events. And a lot of them just fit really neatly into our timeline. And you see the factions along the top of the card. That's how all the coin games work. So every turn you flip over a card and the factions listed at the top, that's the turn order. So all the cards impact the factions in a different way. They have two events, usually a top row and a bottom row. And the top row is normally pro-Allied or pro-Soviet, and the bottom row is pro-insurgent, so it helps the werewolves or the Edelweiss. The game's going to come with about 100 cards. Each one of them is a historical event, and most of those can branch off in two ways, the top or the bottom row, and they change the turn order every turn. So when you play the game, you're going to get a real wacky kind of alternate history timeline of post-1945 Germany, and it can branch off in all kind of weird ways.
Diving into some of the balancing issues, just because we've got the cards up at the moment, is there an equal number or is it imbalance? And did you have to sort of tweak that so that one side didn't have an advantage?
They're balanced in terms of the faction order along the top. Yeah, so there's an equal number of cards where your faction will go first. The game is balanced. I've played it probably 70 times. Plus it's been played by other playtesters, and our ratios of the different factions winning comes out pretty even. So the game is balanced, but it's not just balanced because of the cards. It's balanced because of everything that happens on the map and the different abilities of the four factions and the deals they can make with each other. So they all have a way to hurt each other in a different way. And a lot of the balance actually comes from the factions that you would think of as natural allies can really hurt each other. So, for example, the Allies and the Soviets are meant to be on the same team because they're crushing the insurgents in Germany, but they step on each other's toes a lot. They block each other's movement. They slow each other down. They get involved in this arms race, which chews up a lot of their resources. The Soviets have all kinds of ways to hurt the Allies. The Allies have all kinds of ways to hurt the Soviets. And likewise, Edelweiss and Werewolf are both trying to rid Germany of enemy forces, but they hate each other as well. And they've got lots of ways to hurt each other. So a lot of the balance comes from this four-way struggle where all the other factions can hurt you. So you usually don't get a runaway leader situation.
I assume you've played some of the coin series before you came up with the design. Which of the series? There's quite a lot of games in the series. Which games did you play that you sort of drew most heavily on when making this?
Well, the week before I came up with the idea for Werewolf, I'd played Cuba Libre for the first time, and that's the smallest game in the series. They're actually just released one now, which I haven't played, called The British Way, which is a even more small scale than that. But Cuba Libre is the most common entry-level coin game, and that's about Cuba in the 1950s, about Castro leading his insurgency. So I'd played that a week before coming up with the idea for Werewolf, but since then I've got Andean Abyss, Fire in the Lake, and Colonial Twilight. So I played all four of them a lot as I was designing Werewolf. I was also playing the coin games because obviously that was my target market, was coin players. So I wanted to make sure I understood what made that game series really tick and what was so distinctive about it, as well as making mine different enough from those, because obviously it's not just copied. There's a lot of differences, but I want to make sure it still would appeal to coin gamers.
Okay. When you were coming up with the design and playtesting, were there any particular challenges you found? Common sort of things that come up in coin game design is what stuff you're going to amplify. Like you've chosen some cities, not others. The lines of communication, the population numbers, so on and so forth. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, sure. So the map, we actually came up with that pretty early and hasn't gone through many changes. So the map you're seeing there is pretty much the first map that we came up with. We just had to tweak a few of the numbers around, and that worked out pretty well. We included lines of communication on there because Germany has always had a very well-developed road and rail network, and that would have been a crucial part of it. In contrast to games like Cuba Libre, where there is no lines of communication because it's a small island, it's underdeveloped. So we knew from the start we're going to have lines of communication. We're going to have most of the population in cities because Germany is very urbanized. So in the game, most of the population figures are concentrated in the cities. And so we kept that from the very beginning. The challenges that we had were basically making sure all the factions were balanced, which is probably the biggest issue in any asymmetric game where you have different factions that have totally different abilities, totally different victory conditions, is making sure they're balanced against each other. So that is what required the most testing, and also the specific abilities of the faction. So we've had to tweak those a little bit over playtesting. For example, the allies, we had some, they've got a list of special activities or special actions, and it took me a while to nail down the final one in that list of 4. And I eventually settled on commando raids as the allied 4th special action, which took me a long time to figure that out, but it works out really well. And I want to have commandos in the game in some way. So there was that. And also the werewolves, figuring out their operations and special activities, what they actually do each turn. That involved a fair bit of tweaking. But yeah, mostly it was just the balance stuff. That's why it was play tested. It was play tested 40 times before I sent it off to Legion to pitch. So I sent an email to Legion and said, we've play tested this 40 times already. We've done most of the graphics. It's ready to go. And they replied within 24 hours and said, yes, we want it.
For anyone who's not designed a wargame, the playtesting burden is real, and a bit like rereading and rewriting a PhD or a dissertation, it can be quite torturous at times.
Yeah, and that's my recommendation to anyone that wants to be a designer. I have like a rule of thumb where I say, playtest it on your own 20 times at least before you even tell anyone about it. So, because you may come up with a great idea, but you need to test it. You need to test it over and over again. Like I have Werewolf permanently set up in my shed, and as soon as I finish a game, I reset it. So it's always ready to test. So I've basically been constantly testing it over the last year, or the last 2 years rather. And you need to have a space dedicated to that. You just need to test over and over and over again. Yeah, get a shed. you got to have a
sheds
game
for war
design lab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last one on Werewolf before we move on to Division Commander. Noting the series of games in the coin game series, where do you feel this sort of fits in terms of complexity, theme, and playability?
Yeah, good question. I would say it's somewhere in between Andean Abyss and Fire in the Lake. So Fire in the Lake is the most complicated coin game. That's Vietnam. That's got a lot of rules, a lot of exceptions to rules, and a lot of different subsystems all working at once. Werewolf is not like that. It's way simpler than that, but it is a step up from Andean Abyss, which is the very first one in the series chronologically. That's the one set in 1990s Colombia, which is a great game. I love Andean Abyss. So Werewolf is more complicated than Andean Abyss, has more stuff going on, but not as much as Fire in the Lake. So that'll give coin players a rough idea. If you can handle Fire in the Lake, you'll be able to handle this easily in terms of complexity.
Okay. Before we move off, I note that Ben is also listed as in the authors of this. What was Ben's role?
Yeah, so Ben Feeney is my co-designer. He has done all the graphics. He has come up with most of the cards, and he's play tested it with me a lot. And he's helped me write the rule book and do a whole heap of other stuff behind the scenes. He's very busy. He's his job is probably a bit more demanding than mine, so he's usually very busy. So he doesn't do many of these appearances as I do, but he has been working very hard behind the scenes to get the game to where it is, and he's doing a great job. I actually really like his graphic style.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Top tip for any designer out there is befriend someone who understands how to do graphic design.
Yeah, he actually worked in as a graphic designer, I think, for some big sort of he worked for a TV broadcasting sort of corporation. I think he did some work for magazines and stuff. So he was a graphic designer beforehand, so he knows his stuff really well. And this whole game was made, I think, in Microsoft Publisher. That's all he needed to make the game. Yeah.
But moving to another oft-used format, PowerPoint, and onto our second game. Division Commander, which is a World War II game, although you are working on a modern NATO version. Unlike Werewolf, this is a solitaire game. It's got a logistics-heavy theme. It's also card-driven, and I'll hand over to you in a sec to explain this, but you've got sort of a role-playing game inspiration in terms of tracking key personalities in your division and the experience points of your subordinate regiments and brigades.
Yes, that's right. So Division Commander, the original idea was to make an RPG, so a role-playing game, where you are not an individual, you are a division. That was the original idea, which I just put out there on Twitter. I've just thought of this idea. Don't know if it's any good. And then a publisher reached out to me and said, I want that idea. You make the game. I was like, okay, I'll start making it. From where I originally thought of it to where it is now has changed a lot, but the core of the game is usually it's going to be solo or co-op with a small group. That's 1 to 4 players are going to work together on this. And you're working together to lead a division. And you are in charge of a division in World War II, which means you're in charge of a whole bunch of subordinate battalions, regimental commanders. You have to deal with getting your men food, ammo, medical supplies, fuel, shells. You have different regimental commanders that have traits that can change over the course of a campaign. That part of it's probably being simplified a lot now. That way, it used to be very complicated. Now it's being simplified. You have experience levels of the units, and what you're trying to do over time is through a series of missions is build up your division's reputation. So I call that glory. Right? So you're trying to get glory on the battlefield, but it's not just killing the enemy. You get points for killing enemy battalions, but you lose points for taking casualties. So every battalion that you lose is dropping your level of glory. Also, things like not feeding your men will drop your glory. And then occasionally you'll have situations where, say, you enter unknown territory, you draw a card, and there's refugees that you have to feed. You have to divert some of your food supply to feeding refugees. Or there might be like disease, injuries, exhaustion taking a toll on your division. You've got to spend medical supplies to keep your men alive. So there's all these kind of non-combat related challenges that are built into the game and are a huge part of it. The combat is still important, but a lot of it is actually running the division. And then in the most recent iteration, which is where it's going to go, is as well as having your regimental officers doing their thing, the players themselves represent the staff, the division staff. And I've noticed no game has this, and I was trying to look for sort of inspiration elsewhere, but no other game has this, that as far as I know, where you have players working together, where one is the division commander, one is the intelligence officer or the G2, one is an operations officer, G3, and another one is the supply officer or G4. So when we have a 4-player game of Division Commander, that's what the 4 human players at the table are actually representing, and they have a different responsibility to command the division. So that part of it was very, very challenging to come up with. I think I've got a very good system now, and the card system integrates it. So it's a heavily card-driven game, but basically it's about you and your fellow staff officers having to communicate, share resources, plan ahead, and manage the division on the fly while it's in a combat situation. While it's engaged in a campaign, you've got to keep it operational, and try and achieve the objectives that you've been assigned. So if we look at the maps here, we'll stay on this one, Carentan, which is the first mission that you'll play. It's based on the 101st Airborne, the first edition of the game. So you're going to do a series of missions as the 101st, and you'll see on the map, in this particular scenario, you're going to get dropped into 3 drop zones, spread out across the map. Your battalions are going to be widely scattered. A lot of them are not even going to land in those drop zones. They're going to be somewhere else. And the supplies that were dropped with you are going to be scattered as well. So in this situation, you and your fellow staff officers from D-Day itself are going to have to find where your men are, get them some supplies, group them together, defend your drop zones, and then make a plan to get your regiments to seize their objectives. That's just the first day. You have a lot of stuff to do, and you've got to gather intelligence because you don't know where the enemy is. You've just dropped, you know that the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment and the 91st Luftlandedivision Division are somewhere in the area. You don't know exactly where all their subordinate units are. And you'll see the map has got a lot of question marks on it. So the question marks are unscouted territory. And whenever a battalion moves into unscouted territory, you're going to draw a card and a whole bunch of bad stuff can happen. There's lots of nasty events that can happen to you. So your intel officer has to try and get intel as much as possible to figure out what's going to happen. And the intel officer allows you to peek ahead into the deck. You have a deck of event cards, which are all the nasty things that can happen to you, as well as what the enemy is going to do, enemy movements. And the intel officer is the one that gets to peek at those cards before they get played. So he has an important role from the get-go. And you'll see the map is point to point. Most war games are hexes. I don't like hexes just for a lot of reasons. I think, especially for new players, and this is going to be marketed at people that are not necessarily experienced war gamers. I think if you give people like 10,000 hexes, it's a bit overwhelming. Whereas if you cut down the terrain into a point-to-point map and you drastically reduce the number of spaces, and you make it, follow these paths, and the paths on the map are roughly the major roads, all right, and the points on the map are mostly key objectives or towns or drop zones or whatever. And if they're not a key town or a drop zone or an objective, they're an unknown with a question mark, which is, again, you draw an event card to see what's there. Because this decision space is a lot smaller than a typical hex and counter game, it does two things. It gives the players less to worry about, less to analyze, so they can actually make a decision, make a plan. But it also means you're focusing your attention on what a real commander would have looked at, which is the towns and the roads. They really don't pay a lot of attention to several hundred square kilometers of swamp out to their right flank, because probably the enemy's not going to go into that swamp. You're not going to go to that swamp. You can't get supplies in there anyway. You're probably going to stick to the road network 99% of the time. So I just abstract out a lot of the superfluous terrain and focus in on the key points and the connections between the key points. And you'll see that with a lot of games that have a logistics focus are point to point for that reason, because it narrows your focus down to the key points and the connections between them. And that's where your supplies are going to be moving, as opposed to having 1,000 hexes where, most of them are not going to get used. I understand the point of representing the terrain, having the whole map. So having at least the possibility of going into the middle of nowhere, but generally armies stick to the road network. Like nearly all the time, they're fighting very close to a road and very close to a major city or a town. They very rarely go off in the middle of nowhere. So that's a bit of the reasoning behind the map. And the maps that you see there, they're obviously going to be tweaked. This is just me tinkering around on PowerPoint. Eventually, it's going to look nicer than that. But the maps that I've got there,
get Ben back into.
Yeah, maybe. I want him to come and help me. He's busy at the moment, but I want him to help me tidy this up. But the map it's a very simple method, and this is something I'd encourage people to do if you're not sure how to start making a wargame map. The background to this is the real US Army historical map of the campaign, which you can get online as Google Images. That is the map of the airborne drops in Normandy. And I've just cropped that image, put it as the background on this PowerPoint slide, and then I've just superimposed my circles and squares and lines over the top of it. And then I've just faded it into the background. Like I've just reduced the color contrast to fade into the background. Really simple way to make a wargame map. All right, so if you're stuck on how to do that, just get a historical map, or even if you're doing a modern war game, if you just get like a Google Images map and crop it and put it in a PowerPoint slide, and then just drop your points and connections over the top of it, so these circles and rectangles, you can actually make a pretty workable map. And you've got the terrain in the background. You can see where the main things are, but what your players are focusing on is what you've made clear.
I'm just going to take us off the map for a second, because one of the things I've identified with you, you confirm you're seeing the chits.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Yep. So one of the things you've sort of identified yourself as is moving away from maybe the stochastic dice rolling adjudication method, and you've talked about this on your Twitter account a number of times. So if you could just talk us through the chits, and then also the sort of units that you've represented there, which we'll get down the page to.
Yeah, sure. So the chit system, I got that from a game called Enemy Action Ardennes, but also Enemy Action Kharkov by John Butterfield, who's a really good designer. So this is a way of you still get a semi-random result, but without using dice. So what it is when you go into a battle, say you've got 3 battalions fighting 1 battalion, those 3 battalions are going to draw 3 chits, and these chits will all be in a cup. There's 60 of them. They're double-sided. So your 3 battalions will draw 3 chits, and if the condition on the chit applies to this battle, then the hits are inflicted. So the D1 is a hit to the defender. A1 is a hit to the attacker. So you'll see these ones that you're focusing on are the numerical ratio, so how much you outnumber the enemy by. So if you outnumber the enemy 4-1, you'll get a hit. And if we go down to the other ones, you've got cover, heavy cover, light cover, recon. So if you go into an attack without a recon, you're going to suffer more losses. That represents ambushes coming in. I also have engineers in there. So engineers will reduce your losses because they're clearing minefields and so on. And they will inflict losses on the enemy because they're bringing with them, say, the Bangalore torpedoes, or they're bringing with them the mine cutting equipment to, or the wire cutters and the mine clearing, so you can actually get into the enemy's position. I also have experience level, so that where you see level there, units are level 1 through to 4. So level 4 would be like a battle-hardened paratrooper unit of the 101st that's been fighting for 6 months, and level 1 would be like a German Osttruppen, conscripts that haven't fired a shot. So you've got those 4 experience levels, and they, of course, have a huge effect on the battle. That can avoid losses for you. So if you have an experienced unit in the battle and you draw the right chit, it can cancel losses. And that represents those more experienced troops being able to find cover, use fire and maneuver, use camouflage, whatever, to avoid losses. And then you also have, if you scroll further down, there's other weapon systems that are represented in the chit system, like we've got artillery, or just ARTI, abbreviate it to. You've got anti-aircraft, air, anti-tank, armor. So you think every single weapon system is built into this pile of chits, and all you do is for every unit that's fighting, you just draw a chit out of a cup, and if the condition applies, you do the hit. Now, where this saves you time and complexity when you're playing the game is, normally if you're going to do like a dice-based war game, before you even roll a single dice, you would have to take into account all of these factors. That's how it actually would work. So if you're going to do a dice-based war game, you go, right, I outnumber the enemy 3-1. I go to the 3-1 column on the combat results table. And then if I have tanks and they don't have tanks, I might shift 1 to the right. And then do I have artillery? Oh, yes, I have artillery. I'll shift it 1 to the right. Do I have aircraft? Oh, yes, I have aircraft shifted over. What is the cover level? I have to look at a terrain chart. Oh, it's this kind of cover, so this is going to shift it this way. And you're looking at like 10 things before you even roll the dice. Whereas with this system, you draw the chit first, and then you're only looking at the condition on that chit. It means you don't have to take everything into account every battle. It's going to show you what is relevant in this battle. And because you don't know what it's going to be, you have to plan for it. You have to say, right, if we want an assurance of success, we need combined arms, we need numerical superiority, we need more experienced troops, we need tanks, arty, air, all that kind of stuff, engineers, recon. You need a large combined arms force to be guaranteed a success. But when you get to these smaller battles, you don't know exactly what's going to be relevant. And you don't have to look up every single factor before you roll. So it's a really neat little system. And then I've got 2 little tweaks to it compared to the original John Butterfield system. I've got medals on there. So you see little purple heart icons that are on some of the chits. So that represents your unit doing something really brave and heroic on the battlefield, which is going to upgrade that unit a level. They're going to go to the next level of experience, and it's going to earn your division glory as well. So that happens every now and then. You draw a chit out of the cup, and it might be you've taken heavy losses, like it might be a hit to your own side, but you've earned a medal for that heroic action. And it's a way to factor in, your lower level soldiers and officers. You can't predict when they're going to do something heroic. It might just happen. And then that medal on there it's a nice little bonus for the player. And when you see that coming, you go, oh, great, we've earned some glory, and this unit has been upgraded. So it's a fun little thing. Adds to the RPG aspect as well of your units leveling up as they fight. So that's why the medals are in there. And then the other thing I have that's different to the original is the intel officer can spend intel to peek at the chits before they're drawn. All right. So if you have enough intel on the enemy, which is a numerical resource, so you have an intel track, see how much intel you've got, and you spend it, and it disappears every day. So this, because the battlefield situation is changing, your intel level day to day is going to change. It's going to drop because you may have got lots of intel on the enemy's positions on day one, but day two, he's moved. So that intel is almost worthless. So that intel degrades over time. But when you spend the intel, you can peek into the cup and have a look at what chits are going to come out. So you might know, for example, that artillery is going to be highly relevant here. Like this battlefield is going to be one where artillery will help you. And you can imagine that as the intel officer has said, oh, we know where the enemy is. If we use artillery, we can hit them because we know where they are. We can get our observers to get an accurate bombardment in this location. So your intel level is going to allow you to plan your battles ahead. If you have enough intel, you can know what chits are going to come out of the cup, and therefore you can avoid losses and know what kind of assets to bring. So it's nowhere near as random as dice. It allows you to plan ahead a little bit, and it's a lot less, I think it's a lot less fiddly than a dice-based system where you have to count up factors and then roll. And it's just a lot less random too, because you know the distribution of what's in the cup. So that basically that's the combat system, how that works.
Moving on to units.
Yeah. Well, this is probably going to change. Obviously, the graphics going to change, and a few other things will. But essentially, the only thing you need to know about a unit in this game is the type and the level. So the level is the number. That's the experience level of the unit. And then the unit type will basically tell you everything else about it. Now, eventually, these are going to have specific battalion and regiment identifiers. Like the ones you're seeing here are just generic, but eventually they're going to have like, this is the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne. Those unit identifiers will be added on there later. But for now, this has worked fine for playtesting, where I've got all the main unit types, and these are battalions. So, I don't represent anything less than a battalion. And you've got the little pictures there, but I'm going to keep the pictures because I actually like these better than NATO symbols. I just think they're nicer to look at and they're more intuitive for the players. I know most war games use NATO symbols, but I prefer this. It's a recon battalion because you can see an M2 Greyhound, so that's recon. Armored infantry's got a half track on it. An anti-air battalion has an anti-aircraft gun, so you can look at it and kind of know what type of unit it is a bit more easily and have to look up a chart of symbols. But yeah, that's basically how it's going to stay with a few minor additions. And then, these are the German units too. So the heavy Panzer is a Tiger, you've got flak guns. The Panzers are either Panzer IVs or Panthers. Anti-tank guns, Pak 38s. So just like iconic units from the time, really.
And you got the good old Brits as well?
I got the Brits, yes. So I've got these included because the game includes a Operation Market Garden scenario. So I was going to go the first edition was going to be 101st Airborne. I thought I'll just do American units only. But because it's Market Garden, you have 30 Corps moving up Hell's Highway. I had to have a whole roster of British units in there as well. So, and the other thing I want to do is make these chits and these counters available for people to use when they want to make their own scenarios. So I want to be able to let people make their own division commander scenario. And I've just saved a whole bunch of random symbols down the bottom, which I might use later. This is a sort of a work in progress document. But I will eventually, make the game sort of modular and give players instructions on how they could make their own scenario. Like tell them how to make a map, how to make the units. And then you could have any division you want. Someone out there in the world will put a scenario together to represent that division. And then the game will expand. That's my ultimate plan for it, is to have a whole series of division commander games that cover different divisions.
That's great stuff.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the fascinating world of logistics for a second. Firstly, why did you choose to add it? Noting that a lot of games don't, or they heavily abstract it. And then why did you settle on the sort of three supply types that you did?
Yeah, well, I've actually got ultimately the game will have 5 supply types. The ones that are most relevant for this first edition is food, ammo, and medical supplies. But eventually there's going to be fuel and artillery shells. I'm going to have artillery shells in this one as well, actually. So there's going to be 4, but the 101st Airborne had not much artillery, so you don't use a lot of shells. The big ones is food, ammo, and medical supplies. So I decided on having the logistics focus because that seems to be what historical commanders at the time were always worried about. That's what they talk about in their memoirs and their journals, and that's what the serious sort of books on military history are always talk about: logistics, the fuel shortages, ammo shortages, and you can read almost any battle in World War II, and you'll have things like in Carentan, the one we're looking at now, the Germans have 2 battalions of pretty hardcore paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger from the 6th Regiment, defending Carentan, and they fight all day in hand-to-hand combat against multiple American battalions, and they actually hold their own pretty well, and they manage to force them back. But then they run out of ammunition, so they have to withdraw and give up the town. And they've been told by Hitler, you have to hold this at all costs, right? So they have to hold Carentan at all costs. This is about a week after D-Day, but the regiment is out of ammo, so they withdraw. Now, some games have this kind of stuff represented as an abstract supply line. So your troops are either in supply or out supply, meaning that if you can trace a line on the map back to a supply source, it's assumed that enough of every resource is hitting your front line. But that's just not the case. I mean, in this particular battle that I'm talking about, there was an open supply line, but there's not enough supplies, so the men have to withdraw. And this happens all the time. It happens in Bastogne as well. It happens in Market Garden. Any battle you care to think of, when you look down at a unit history, so much of the decision making is tied into the logistics. You run out of fuel, your tanks stop. You are waiting for the fuel to catch up to your tanks. You run out of ammo, you can't fight. Your men have to withdraw if they have no ammo. If you got no food, the men will not go into an assault. They won't hold the line. They won't follow orders if they're not being fed. You have to feed the men, and so many games just totally ignore that. And the other thing is medical supplies, and that I included that because when the Allies invaded Normandy, a huge part of their supply line was getting blood, plasma, bandages, and penicillin. And that's one of the reasons the casualty rate in World War II is so much lower than in World War I, at least for the British and the Americans, is that they had to have vast quantities of medical supplies being filtered down to the regimental aid stations to get these guys patched up. Blood transfusion is huge. Blood transfusion saved probably millions of lives in this war. So did penicillin to stop infection. So in the game, you will be able to, as the division commander, set up aid stations and put medical supplies on them. So, for example, in the one we're looking at now in Bastogne, historically, right in the middle in the town of Bastogne, I think in the church, they set up an aid station there. That's where they stockpiled the medical supplies, and that's where the casualties are brought back to. And you, as the division commander in the game, it's going to be your responsibility to set that up and make sure there's enough medical supplies going there. And a key part of this battle was the Germans managed to infiltrate behind the American lines and capture a huge pile of their supplies, including bandages and blood and so on, and artillery shells and all that kinds of stuff. And that was a huge part of the battle. Like the division commander was really worried about that for obvious reasons. The Germans have managed to infiltrate behind the lines and capture their supplies. So they have to reorient the division and send a whole regiment spread out in a long line in their rear to guard what was left of their supplies. And also with artillery ammunition, this is a huge thing in any World War II battle. And the American army in World War II was probably the best supplied army of all. And even they were constantly burning through artillery shells. They're like, we need more shells. We have to ration our shells. And you can just imagine what the situation is like for the Germans, their supply situation is about 10 times worse. You really have to ration your artillery shells. You can't just fire bombardments all the time. And likewise with fuel for your tanks and so on, and ammunition for your men. All of these things is what a commander would be really worried about. It's what their logistics or their supply officer, their G4, that's what they would be worried about. It can decide a battle. I also wanted to include it because I've played a lot of Euro games, a lot of these games like Agricola and Catan and Caelus, and these ones that are heavily focused on resource management. So I had a bit of a background in how to make a game on resource management. And this is also the Coin series uses this as well. In the Coin series, there's a lot of colored wooden cubes, and just aesthetically, it looks different to a counter. I like the look of it. So this game's going to include wooden cubes for the resources, but it's about this planning ahead, knowing what resources you're going to need, knowing that they're at the right place at the right time. I wanted that to be a big part of the game because it's historical. It allows me to use a bit of my Eurogame experience, and it's just something that isn't done in most wargame designs. So I think when you play the game, if you play as the supply officer, the G4, I want that to be a stressful experience. You're in charge of the supplies of the division. So you should have the other players shouting at you all the time, saying, we need ammo, we need shells, we need food, we need medical supplies. Where are they? When are they going to get here? And you should be like scrambling to get that stuff where it needs to go. because that's how it actually works in a real battlefield situation. Most of the time, that is what you're most worried about. So yeah, that's kind of why it's such a huge part of the game.
And visually, are these supply tokens on this map or are they on a tracker? Because sometimes I see in logistics elements are put onto a tracker, and that can tend to make them almost like a side game, and to lose the importance, or it becomes a distraction from the events that are happening on the main table.
No, yeah. So the supplies are on the map. Okay, so the supplies that your men have on hand are on the map with the units. And there's many situations where your supplies are going to be lost. So, for example, in the very first scenario, the Carentan one, where you're airdropping over Normandy, some of your supplies, those tokens, you're going to physically drop them on the battlefield from a height of about 30 centimeters. You hold these supply tokens in your hand and you're going to drop them, and wherever they land is where they land. So you might have a situation where you've got a battalion that's dropped in some town somewhere in Normandy, and their ammo is a couple of spaces away, and they haven't scouted the territory between them and the ammo, and they're going to have to fight their way through unknown whatever's there to try and get their supplies, so that the supplies will be on the map. And of course, if the enemy moves onto your supplies, they take them, they're gone. So you do have to protect them. You have to make sure the areas where you've stocked up big piles of supplies are well guarded. You might want to leave a couple of battalions there, entrench them, and have that as a safe supply depot. And that's where you draw them from. They're on the map when they're at hand, when they're able to be used. When they're en route to the battlefield, when they're like approaching from off map, they're going to be on the turn track. So the turn track is going to tell you what turn it is. And a turn is a day. And the supply officer, the G4, he is going to have to plan up to 3 days in advance what supplies are needed by the division. So let's say and it's going to be based on cards. So the availability of the supplies depends on what cards you have in your hand. But let's say the division needs ammo. We're going to be fighting a series of battles with our infantry against enemy infantry. We need ammo. So the G4 is going to think, all right, we're going to need at least 3 units of ammo, right? 3 little discs that represent ammo. If he wants the full amount of them, he's going to have to put them a couple of turns ahead on the turn track. Let's say 2 turns ahead. So you're in turn 1, you're going to get the ammo on turn 3 because it's on trucks behind the line. It's being driven to you. And by the time the turn reaches turn 3, then you'll get that ammo. It'll come to you via the supply line. But of course, if you've planned your supply situation based on what's happening right now, but the supplies are getting to you 2 days from now, the situation on the battlefield has changed in 2 days. Right? And you have to factor that in. You have to plan not only what do we need now, what's going to change in the next 2 to 3 days, and then when we do get the supplies, where are they going to go? How much of them can we spend? So the turn track system, which I'm playtesting at the moment, working pretty well. That whole part of it means the division commander and the G4 are always thinking 3 days in advance. They're thinking like D plus 3. Or say, if you do like language of turns, the current turn will be labeled as T, and you're thinking, how are we going to survive T plus 3? What's coming down the pipeline? And then the other thing, because it's an airborne division, a lot of the time they didn't have access to an overland supply line. They had getting their supplies airdropped. So this is the case in Market Garden and in Carentan. For the first couple of days of an operation, if you're an airborne division, you've got to plan for the first 3 days of the operation. You have no overland supply route, which means the men have whatever they can carry, which is not much. And any further resupply is going to be dropped by parachute, which in World War II is a really dicey operation. And a lot of those supplies end up in German hands because they're dropping crates with a parachute on them, and they just get scattered over a huge area. If it's a windy day, they just get scattered over a huge area. So you're going to have an unreliable airborne supply source for a lot of your operation. And then even when you do get an overland supply source linked up, you have to be thinking 2-3 days in advance. And that's where a huge challenge of the game is going to be. But it's fun. I'm playing it all the time. I've got Werewolf set up, and I've got this set up next to it, and I'm playing it all the time, playtesting it, and it's good. It has that feeling of like it's stressful, but it's really enjoyable too.
And you're working on a modern NATO version.
Yes, I'm going to put in a proposal to the NATO Wargame Design Challenge, which is coming up. The deadline for that is about 30 days from now. So NATO is accepting proposals from just civilians like me even though I'm Australian, I'm going to be part of a team. I'm going to have some American guys working with me, and they're going to submit it on my behalf because I'm not actually a citizen of a NATO country. But anyway, I am going to work on a proposal to make a version of this, but set in a hypothetical war in the year 2030 in Eastern Europe. And I've chosen that date because the US Army's overhauled their division structure. They're going to have a totally new division structure by 2030. So I'm going to make a game that allows US officers and staff officers to play out what it's going to be like to command one of their 2030 model divisions in a hypothetical conflict in Europe, which I think NATO kind of needs that. I think that fits in with their priorities now, because it was the case that the US Army was relying on brigade combat teams as the main tactical unit, and the division was just a modular kind of structure that didn't actually fight as a unit on the battlefield. You could just slot brigade combat teams in and out of a division, but they are going to change to having the division as the main tactical unit. And of course, the division's a lot larger than the brigade combat team. They haven't actually deployed a division to fight as a division in battle in a very long time, and they're overhauling the whole division structure. So I think it'll be useful for them. So I've got 30 days to make the proposal. I don't know if it's going to be accepted or not. Even if it's not accepted, I'm still going to make the game eventually, though, somewhere down the track. So that'll be called probably Division Commander 2030, and that'll be a near future conflict in Eastern Europe, obviously between Russia and NATO.
And just briefly, because I want to get onto the third game, what are the sort of top 3 changes you think you're going to see between a World War II division commander and a 2030 division commander?
Oh yeah, so there's going to be a lot. From what I can see, there's 3 big technological changes between the two. I'd say helicopters, drones, and guided missiles are the big technological changes. So every division in the US Army, most divisions in the US Army, are going to have a combat aviation brigade with a whole heap of Black Hawks, Apaches. They used to have Kiowa Scout helicopters, but they're phasing them out. But every division is going to have its own organic helicopter brigade, which means those helicopters can be used for attack, they can be used for recon, they can be used for airborne assault, and a lot of US divisions are going to be trained in how to do that. So that's one big thing. Helicopters, obviously not a thing in World War II battlefields. It gives the division its own organic air transport, which you can imagine these guys, the 101st back in 1944, would have killed to have a brigade of helicopters just on hand, even just to shift supplies and even just to do medical evacuation, medevac. That would have saved so many lives in World War II if we had helicopters. So that's a big one. Guided missiles are huge. The US has been shipping over a fair few of those to Ukraine. They seem to be, from what I can gather, and I can't get a lot of reliable information on what's going on in Ukraine, but the guided missiles seem to be a pretty good way to stop columns of tanks. So you can't really have a column of tanks approaching a battlefield in safety anymore. Like you're basically under a constant threat of a missile taking out your tanks. And then the other thing that's a technological change is the drones, or sort of UAVs. And not just the UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. There's also going to be unmanned ground vehicles, going to be unmanned submarines. So there's going to be drones, land, sea, and air. They're cheap. They don't cost a human life if they get shot down. They can be guided by infantry on the battlefield. So the purpose of infantry, a lot of it is going to be spotting for the missiles or spotting for the drones. And you'll notice that not a lot of manned fixed wing aircraft have been used in Ukraine because they're expensive. You can't afford to risk your pilots. So a lot of the aerial warfare is drone warfare. And I think that's going to be a huge change. And then as well as that, there are some organizational changes too. So a modern, or say a 2030 American division is going to have a whole lot more engineers. It's going to have a whole lot more what they call a sustainment. Like they're going to have a whole sustainment brigade, which is your logistics. It's not just logistics. It's going to be some other stuff too. It's going to have your military police and whatever. But you're going to have an entire brigade dedicated to getting the supplies to the front and keeping the division operational. So I think that's again something a World War II division would have loved to have had is that level of logistical support, as well as having things like even the battalion structure is going to be slightly different. So a US Armored Division in 2030 is going to be probably the battalion is going to be 2 companies of tanks and 2 companies of mechanized infantry working together as a combined arms battalion. So it's basically going to be every tank that's fighting on a battlefield is going to have armored infantry close at hand for support. You're not going to have tanks fighting on their own. They're always going to be integrated with mechanized infantry. So you're going to have a roughly even ratio of Abrams main battle tanks to Bradley fighting vehicles carrying troops. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of other. I mean, there's so many the computers and cyber warfare. You've got the chemical, biological, nuclear options as well. There's so much stuff, but I think the main ones are going to be the emphasis, the higher emphasis on logistics and combined arms, and drones, guided missiles, and helicopters. That's the big difference between World War II and 2030. I think there's probably some other stuff that I'm missing, and if anyone's got any ideas, feel free to contact me and tell me, because I'm not by any means an expert on this, but that's my impression.
I'm sure you're going to get plenty of special interest lunatics telling you it's all about their particular field, but there's only so much you can include. So be brutal. Okay, last one we're on to, which is by far the simplest, but no less enjoyable, is Eastern Theatre of Operations, which is a postcard game which you've submitted to the Postcards from the Front competition. So this is also available freely to download. You describe it as a solitaire game from D-Day to Remagen in 10 minutes. You've only got 17 components, which includes the map. And once again, you've gone for a deterministic resolution system as opposed to dice.
Yeah, just to clarify, the games, the ETO stands for European Theatre of Operations.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, that's fine. It's just that's what the Americans call that half of the war. They've got the Pacific Theatre and the European Theatre. That's where the name comes from. But yeah, it's basically World War II in the West from D-Day onwards all the way through to when they crossed the Rhine. So it's a nice, simple little game. You can do it 2-player, but I think most people are going to play it solo, and it's available for free. Anyone can download. All you do is just print off this postcard and cut it out. And that's all you need. You don't need any dice. You don't need anything else. And basically, it's got a race against time for the Allies to try and get into Germany without taking excessive losses. So their time goes down. The time they've got to take Germany goes down as they take more losses. So as the casualties mount, they have to win the war quicker. And the Germans are trying to delay them and also throw them back with an occasional counterattack. And the combat system it's like you said, deterministic. There's no dice, there's no luck at all. So you know what's going to happen. Imagine each of these counters is an army, and you're going to only have 2 per space. And this is very, very roughly historical. Like if you look at those areas of operation, when the Allies landed in Normandy, they sent 2 armies. That's what they could sustain on D-Day. They could sustain 2 armies. And likewise, when the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, they really are only sustaining 2 armies, a frontage of 2 armies at a time. So basically the stacking limit is 2 counters per space. And I went with a deterministic combat system just because I wanted this to be more of like a little puzzle, and more and not having luck play any role in it. I want you to figure out mathematically how you can actually get to this location within this amount of time. But also you have some things up your sleeve. You can launch major offensives. So the Allies can do 3 major offensives. The Germans can do 1. Those major offensives basically represent, for the Allies, they got 3. The first one you should use is D-Day. Just to get into Normandy, you should be using a major offensive to do that. That's a really hard thing to do without the Germans counterattacking and throwing you out. The other one is Market Garden, and then the other one is Patton, basically his breakout with the Third Army. And then the Germans have 1 major offensive, which is Battle of the Bulge. So you can, once you spend your major offensive, it's gone. That allows you to double your combat strength for 1 battle. But basically, you look at the numbers of the units, and the highest numbers win. And the attacker always takes losses. So it privileges the defender in these battles. So usually the Allies are going to be attacking. They're going to take heavy losses every time they attack. And then one little cool thing about the game is the little paratrooper unit, which represents the Allied Airborne Army. So a combination of 101st and 82nd Airborne from the Americans, and the 6th Airborne, or the 1st Airborne for the British, depending on what time scale you're looking at. And the point of the paratroopers is they ignore the stacking limit. So they drop behind enemy lines, which means they're not using the road network, and they're not using the shipping to go from the UK to Normandy. They're not using the boats. And when they paradrop in, they're not using the roads, so they ignore the stacking limit. It's a way for you to squeeze in an extra army. And because the numbers are so low, just having that extra +1 in a battle can totally swing it. So you've got to protect your paratroopers, and you only will use them a couple of times because they're so valuable. Once they're dead, you can't replace them. And you look at your tank units as well. The British have got 1, and the Americans have got 2. The Germans have got 2. Those tank units, you got to use them sparingly, and once they're used in an offensive, they flip over to their weakened side, and they're just level 1. So that's there we go. That's what it is. So when the units flip over, they have that little white line through them, so they're under strength, and every unit can just take 2 hits and it dies. And all the rules fit on a postcard. So something that's pretty easy. You just got to print it out and glue it back to back, cut it out, and you got yourself a nice little war game that you can play in about 10 minutes. So I've had a lot of fun with it. I've played it probably 20 times and had a lot of fun with it.
It looks to me like this is something that might have been an idea for a classroom game, but did it start out like that?
No, not really. I just saw the idea for the postcards from the front popped up on Twitter, and I was actually the first to start working on it. I contacted the guy and said, "Yeah, I'm going to make one. This is a great idea," and I just started making it straight away and got it done. I don't know, within a week or so. But when I do classroom games, this is the kind of combat system I use. The deterministic system. Like, what have you got? What have you got? Highest number wins. Basically, that's how it works, because it saves time. No randomness. It means it's pure strategy. It's got the old diplomacy board game where there's no dice rolling. It's just, I've got 2 armies, you have 1 army, so I win. So it really just rewards planning and thinking ahead rather than luck. So a lot of my classroom games, if they have any military conflict in them at all, are just this deterministic system. And as I think I mentioned on Twitter as well, I'm going to probably do a Mediterranean theater version of this as well.
Yeah, I think that'd be really good. Just going into some of the sort of, this is the one I have played of the 3 we've done. I can sort of see, and you've got some exceptions to the rules, which because again, your play system, you've abstracted it heavily, but probably in playtesting you realise that you needed an unlimited stacking limit in the UK, and you also needed an unlimited stacking limit in Normandy to allow for the inload of the Allied armies.
Yes, that's right. And I added that in because first of all, the Allies could historically amass a huge amount of men and equipment in Normandy because of the Mulberry harbours and because they see Cherbourg. So after the Allies take Normandy, it's assumed that they set up those harbours and they can actually have the supply capacity to build up a huge amount of men there. So the Allies did actually, at one point, I think, concentrate like 1 million men in Normandy and kept them obviously alive and supplied and fed, and with all their equipment and their jeeps and their half tracks and tanks all operational. So that is historical, that breaking the stacking limit rule. And also because if I didn't have that stacking limit rule for Normandy, it's too easy for the Germans to throw the Allies back into the sea. They can just wait for the Allies to attack, and then they counterattack and win. And the Allies have to do several D-days to try and win. And of course, the Allies, if they had failed on D-Day, they couldn't just have gone and done another D-Day next week, because it's, years and years of planning go into that operation. So the game is kind of set up so the Allies will probably win D-Day the first time. They'll take Normandy, and they can build up their forces in Normandy. So the Germans can't throw them into the sea as Hitler wanted to do, but they will take losses when they take Normandy, of course. And what exact forces they use to take Normandy will matter, because say they send the airborne and they send tanks in and they get damaged, it means they're not available to go into Belgium or France. So then they've got to waste time bringing men over from the UK, resupplying them and sending them in. So when you play it, it does work out roughly historically. It's very, very abstract at a high level, but it does play out roughly historically with that temporary unlimited stacking rule for Normandy and for the UK, of course.
And one of the ways you've abstracted supply. So you've got the supply line, but the way you resupply in this game, the Allies having the advantage, they can resupply everything in one space, and the Germans can just resupply 1 unit. Yes,
and I think that reflects the historical situation pretty well. So the Allies, if you had 6 units sitting in Normandy and they're all damaged, you can bring them all back up to full strength. Whereas the Germans, they're limited to just one. They can flip 1 unit back to fresh. If they choose that as their action. And every turn you only get 1 action. So if you're doing resupply as your 1 action, it means you're not moving anything and you're not attacking. So when you play the game as you've played it, the Germans will desperately want to resupply, but they only do it when they get a bit of breathing room, and they'll obviously focus on getting the panzers resupplied. But they should be sort of hard up against it to try and keep their units at full strength.
And in the playthroughs that I've done, the Allies initially have the advantage in doing the major offensive into Normandy, And then as they expand into a two-front, Belgium, France, and then a three-space front, Holland, Belgium, France, that's where you then there seems of an opportunity for the German player to launch their one counterstroke that they're allowed, their one major offensive.
Yes, that's right.
Either from the Rhine or historically from the Rhine into Belgium, but possibly from Germany into Holland, if that is auspicious for the player. And that's really the only, not the only decision, but that's really the timing for the German player to sort of to cue that up and to watch what the Allied player is doing, because by that point the Allied player is trying to resupply one of three spaces. So we'll often have a clear front that is advancing, one that is lagging because they are on their weakened side, and if they're on their weakened side, they can't attack as per the rules. So it becomes more obvious what the Allied player is going to do, or they have to spend time to bring everybody up to full fighting effectiveness, which gives the Germans more time to bring their troops back up to full fighting effectiveness and husbanding their reserves. So that, to me, that's where the tension in the game comes down to. Normally between the 10 and 15 turn point, that's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, I like it, and I really wanted the game to sort of, the focal point of the game is when the Germans launch the bulge, like when they do their one offensive that they can actually pull off. And you're right, the game is set up so they'll probably do it historically from the Rhine into Belgium, but it could be done earlier, it could be done in a different place, and the Allies have that threat, like, the Germans can launch one big attack, and obviously the Germans are going to try and strike when the Allied supply line is stretched to its limit. And I also want to have that decision of, when the Allies were advancing into France and Belgium, and you had Monty wanting to go into Holland or the Netherlands to do Market Garden, and then you had Patton wanting to just keep barreling straight forward to the Rhine, and it was decided to go ahead with Market Garden. And then after Market Garden, which is a failure, the Allied line is sort of overstretched, and then they go into winter of 1944 with their Belgium supposedly being a safe sector where the Americans are resting some weakened units. And that's when the Germans choose to make their strike. So you have the key decisions of this part of the war, like from D-Day to the Rhine, at the big, high army level decisions. You do have that. You have that, like, do we go into Holland or do we go into the Rhine? And for the Germans, when do we launch this one big offensive we can actually launch? And then there's obviously little decisions along the way. But because the game is played about 10 minutes, you don't need a huge number of dramatic turning points. I think it's fun. Just the Germans launching their one big attack is a really fun part of the game.
And in their laydown at the start, there's sort of two courses of action: whether you push armor forward to be strong at the front, or you husband it and hold it back. Wait till the Allies have sort of committed to front to sort of axes, because the traditional model would be to put an infantry and an armor together. Infantry to take the hit, and with the armor that gives them a 3, which is which, unless you have two armored units together, is the highest number you can put. And therefore, knowing the deterministic system as you do from reading the rules, that's quite a potent force. But then the Allies having 3 armored units, they can stack 2 together, get a 4, which means that can overpower a traditional 1-2 combined arms team. And then you can throw the paratrooper unit in on the top, which is their sort of ace in the hole if they haven't.
That's right. So the Allies can always, in theory, the Allies can always beat a German army. Like if they, even if the Germans have both of their Panzer divisions maxed on the Panzer armies on the defensive, the Allies can still beat it. They use 2 armor armies with the airborne. So it's like, the Allies obviously have the overwhelming superiority. But with the German player, you've got the decision of where to put your Panzers in the beginning. And you can do what I think Rommel wanted to do and have the Panzers right up at the beachhead, have the Panzer divisions deployed right up on Normandy, and then maybe have a chance of inflicting heavy losses on the Allies as they land in the beaches, or you keep them back in reserve and muster them for a counterattack, which is probably what you should do. It's kind of risky having a Panzer army deployed in Normandy because it's going to die, but it does kind of force the Allies to commit a little bit more of their forces to that initial beach landing. So either way, you can do it, but because you only have 2 Panzer units, the decision of where to put them and when to commit them to that big offensive is the big German decision for the game.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a throwaway force, because once you've committed it and the Germans go second, they're then on their reduced side, and then the Allies get to go, so they can potentially wipe out, do a sort of Falaise pocket on your armored forces, and then there's no comebacks in this. If it's dead, it's dead.
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
So how would you carry this forward to the Mediterranean theatre?
Well, you see the game's got 7 spaces, and it's got only one of those is like an amphibious connection. So UK to Normandy, that's an amphibious one. And in the Mediterranean theatre, I think you could get away with a very similar kind of setting with 7 spaces, but I would do it probably Libya with Egypt next to it, and then maybe Morocco next to it. So where the Americans come in, Operation Torch, they land in Morocco, they come over Libya. So you have Morocco, Libya, Egypt as 3 down the bottom. And then the next stepping stone would be from Libya to Sicily, which would be like an amphibious little stepping stone. And then from Sicily to southern Italy, which would be another little amphibious stepping stone. And then southern Italy to northern Italy. So that's 6 spaces that I've just said there. You could also add in Malta, but there wasn't really any large-scale attempt to invade it, so I'd probably leave that off. But the other option is to have Tunisia as a separate space. I might go Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and then that's Tunisia over to Sicily. But it's good because if you did the whole Mediterranean theatre, say starting in 1940, the Germans and Italians would have the initial advantage. They'd have the option of pressing the British really hard in Egypt. The British would have to be on the defensive and holding the line initially, and then they'd start pushing back. And then at some point, the Americans would come in, and then the Axis are flipped onto the defense. But they can hold this line as a series of bottlenecks going back to Sicily, and then southern Italy, and then northern Italy in that series of like the Gothic line, the Gustav line, and so on. So you'd have this situation where the Axis have a chance to quickly attack Egypt early on and get a big victory there. But then from, say, the second half of the game onwards, the Allies are going to be slowly grinding them down and forcing them back all the way to Rome. So I think it'll be a nifty little game, very similar to this one. But obviously, you'd have to have a distinction of the British and the Americans being 2 nationalities, because the British are fighting from the beginning. The Americans don't come until later. And likewise, the Italians and the Germans would have to have 2 different units. I'd say that obviously the Germans would have a smaller number of better quality units, and the Italians would probably have a lot of units that are just strength 1 on one side. And then when you flip them in their damage, they go down to 0, because like an exhausted Italian army is just going to die. Obviously, that's what happened. So the Germans will be the backbone of the Axis, and they'll only have probably 3 units to use. And then the Italians might also have 3 or 4 units. And then the Allies, similar to this game, you might have, say, 3 British armies and then 5 American armies, something like that. But I think it'll be an interesting little puzzle.
Yeah, I'm sensing there is almost a 2-part bit to your supply, where the Axis supply is harder over the seas from mainland Italy to Africa because of Malta.
Yes.
And then maybe easier on mainland Italy.
Yes, definitely. And I would actually maybe even have a navy token for both sides, and then the navy wouldn't actually fight, but the position of your navy
control of the seas, maybe, or
control the seas to block the supply. Yeah, because obviously the Italians in North Africa got no supplies as long as Malta was there as a base for Allied submarines and ships and planes to attack them. So I'd have something like that.
Having watched the Mincemeat, which is a remake of the Man Who Never Was film, they could, because you've got a bit of a racetrack, a single car racetrack going through Africa. There isn't as many branches as you see here with France, Belgium, Holland. You could have the Sardinia, Greece boxes, which are additional VPs, and then you've got that kind of counter deception aspect.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. Yeah,
because otherwise it's pretty obvious you're coming straight over the straits and all that stuff. But no, I'd love to help you out with it with any playtesting, etc.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'll get to it probably after I do this proposal.
After you've done NATO 2030, yeah.
After I've done that, yeah, and I've still got to get more pre-orders for Werewolf too. I've got to keep plugging that. So, but yeah, I will eventually get to Mediterranean. I'll just call it MTO, Mediterranean Theatre of Operations, MTO, as a sequel to ETO.
Yeah,
I put it out there.
And I suppose if you follow the natural course of events, you can have ETO, MTO, PTO, Pacific,
Pacific,
and then you could put in an Eastern Front one as well.
Yeah.
Then if you do want to make it for students, then they've got the whole
war
in a box, and then they could get onto Werewolf at the end as a sort of treat.
That's a good idea. Having 4 postcard games that is all of World War II, just 4 postcards, and then you just put them next to each other in a rectangle, like, oh, there's the whole war. That was that's a cool idea. Yeah.
Maybe doing a blitzkrieg one for the first.
Oh yeah, for 1939 and 40.
Yeah, because we always forget that bit. Yeah. I did actually see someone did Normandy. Each beach was a postcard game. So when you put all five together, and that was it's a hex and counter one and a card draw system. So maybe not quite the stuff you're into, but fairly simple. So you could do the whole of Normandy for your kids, etc. To all the way from Omaha to Juneau and Sword, etc. With all the and even if, again, one of the things I always say games, like, even if you're not playing it, sometimes just visualizing it's really useful to say, these are the key, this is the terrain, these are the strength. What do you notice the difference between the maps? Like, oh, that this is much more restrictive, there's more units here, there's more Germans defending, there's more blockhouses, or there's less armor, and it just unlocks all the reading, which people just goes over their head when they watch it.
Oh, you tell you what infuriates me is military history books with no maps. And there's so many of them, and they banging on about towns and roads, and it infuriates me to no end. You need to have a map in there. Why is there no map? I don't just know the geography of France and Belgium off the top of my head, and that's what games do. Is they let you visualize the battlefield. You've got to have that. You can't just read text and understand a battlefield.
And postcard games are great if you're going on a school trip or a battlefield study in the military, and you're going to these places, because the modern terrain, although the relief is the same, the towns have just sprawled 4 times larger, and the roads are vastly improved, and the trees have all been cut down. So you sort of look at the terrain and you have no real sense of what it looked like, and sometimes we lack the pull through from that. So playing ETO into then a game about the beaches, into then a tactical game about fighting in a hedgerow, you could sort of understand like why someone had the short end of the stick in the lowest level game, because someone at the higher level needed to take this to unlock a port to bring in supplies, and it all kind of fits. There's a danger sometimes we go straight to the personal level, where we've got someone's personal history, and we fixate on them, and we say they weren't supported enough, or they they were thrown in at the deep end, and only when you actually go higher up do you realize that people didn't have a good option and a bad option. They just had 2 bad options.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what's funny about in the Second World War, is even the American army, which is the most well supplied force in the whole conflict, and has the luxury of planning from a distance and having 2 oceans separating it from the enemy, and enormous amounts of money, and the ability to plan all their operations in detail, and highly talented people working for them. They still have major problems getting their men supplied. They even have manpower shortages, which shocked me, but they did. They were running out of men by early 1945, like frontline men. I mean, on the sharp end, so every army goes through this.
Yeah, cannibalizing people to make infantry.
Yes,
always works out well for them.
That's right. Well, look, mate, I'm gonna have to go soon, so we might have to wrap it up there.
No, thanks very much. That's pretty much me complete. All it leaves me to do is say thank you very much for your time.